All right, so Trauma 101. This is the basics, the essentials. Got a recording of this, you can come back to it. I would love everyone in the world to know this about trauma. So our team in Ukraine taught every teacher, every doctor, and every nurse in Lviv this basic stuff. And I would like that for the world, okay? So my first question would be, why learn about trauma? Why would we learn about trauma? So my answer to that would be because it informs everything. It helps everything. So who's a parent? Okay, this will help your parenting. Okay, I have many students who are parents and they say this helps. Who's a leader of some kind? Okay, who's a coach or a facilitator of some kind? You absolutely have to know this if you're a coach or a facilitator. As a manager, it's really helpful. I can go, this employee is having a trauma response. Now's not the time to tell them off, right? As a manager, it helps so much, so much. In terms of your own well-being, it's impossible to be healthy without at least being trauma aware. Okay, so trauma will destroy your health. Trauma will also destroy your relationships. So even a small amount of trauma can really damage your marriage, your friendships. It can be a problem, yeah? In terms of work and productivity, it's also very helpful. So for me, I would just like this basic trauma knowledge to be available to the world as standard. Okay, so even if it's just like this 10 minutes we're gonna do now before the break, yeah? All right, so I guess we should first say, what is trauma? Nobody has an answer to this. There is no one answer, but you'll hear different answers. So tell me what you've come up with, and then I'll add to that. So if someone said to you, what is trauma? What would you say?
Response to what's happening.
Yeah, so often there's a distinction between response to what's happening and what's happening. So people used to say trauma was like the event. They used to say it's an event that includes threat to life, limb, or integrity of self. It was an old definition from the psychological manual. However, it's the response that's critical. Let me give you an example. If someone tried to punch you, would that be traumatic? Who thinks yes? If someone tried to punch you. Who thinks no? Okay, well, it depends who you are. For example, I've done martial arts for 20 years. I would call that entertaining. Okay, I would call that Friday night, like a Thursday evening class. You know, I do that for fun. I go to places for fun where people try to hit me in the face, okay? But that's in that context, with my context of training and experience. If someone was a beginner, we would just attack them, right? So it's a good example because generally, someone trying to punch you in the face could well be traumatic. 10 guys trying to punch me in the face in a dark alley when I'm not expecting it, yeah, that could be traumatic. So the key thing is your response, and that includes how resourced you are. Yeah, the context, the meaning making, all these things, okay? That being said, I quite like the fact that trauma used to have this, it had to be quite serious, right? Like life, limb, or integrity of self, like a rape, for example, right? Something violating, yeah? What I think is good in this is that we can't say anything's traumatic. These days you'll hear people say, oh my God, it was so traumatic, there was no chocolate. Oh my God, it was so traumatic in the coffee break, there wasn't real coffee. I'm like, no decaf is traumatic. I'm like, be quiet, go back to California, I work in Ukraine, right? So this is a very interesting thing. Is trauma objective or subjective? It's difficult because if we just say it's objective, then actually sometimes the meaning really does matter. I'll give you an example. I once walked outside of my door in Ethiopia and there was a dead horse in the street being eaten by dogs. I was quite traumatized by this. Now, if I just saw a dead horse normally, it would be ugly, but I wouldn't be traumatic. But the meaning it had to me was, oh my God, I'm in a dangerous country where animals just die and there's no one to pick them up and there's chaos and disease and oh my fucking God, I'm not safe. That was the meaning making for me at that time. That's why that became a traumatic memory. It wasn't the horse. Does it make sense? So there does need to be some sense of subjectivity and meaning making in our definitions of trauma. What other definitions of trauma have you heard? If someone says, what's trauma? What's your quick answer?
Something overwhelming.
Yep, it's just a classic that trauma is overwhelming. It's not just stressful. Okay, so yes, there's stress, but there's overwhelming stress. Often it's overwhelm or violation. Often another word you'll hear a lot is powerlessness. Okay, so if I'm fighting in a boxing match and I'm a boxer and he's a boxer and I'm trained, I'm not powerless. But if someone just attacks you and you're not trained, you're powerless. So the feeling of powerlessness or of overwhelm is a key thing. It's not just annoying or angry or stressful or scared, it's too much. Sometimes you'll hear too much, too soon, too often. There's a kind of a poetic definition almost. I forget who's one of the main trauma teachers. I like that definition. It's not exactly exact. Any other definitions? Yeah, normally it involves a somatic response. So the two most common ones are a contraction or a dissociation. So fight or flight you may have heard of. Okay, so this is in Buddhism, this is just called aversion, fight or flight. Freeze is also, part of trauma for most people. So this is a more, we'll talk about the neurology of this, these are hierarchical. Okay, so if there's a loud noise, someone may hear a bang, orientating freeze. That's not a true freeze, it's just orientating. If you're scared, you can run away. If you can't run away, you might fight. If you can't fight, you might freeze. I'm going to talk about this in much more depth, but this is our evolutionary heritage. This is cross-cultural. Every culture has these biological responses. Okay, Japanese, Croatian, whatever. One way of looking at trauma, it's not the only way, but I think it's quite a good simple way, is being stuck in fight, flight, freeze. Okay, so in a normal situation, let's say this window collapsed. I had that happen in a workshop. The window just fell out and smashed. It wasn't put in well. Everyone was scared. Everyone goes, the window. You have a shock response in your body. Your adrenaline goes up. Your cortisol goes up. There's all this physiological, neurotransmitters and hormones. People have studied this physiology quite well. And then what happens afterwards? You relax. After 10 minutes, 20 minutes, people are calm again. Okay, you've established safety again. Senses like I'm not under threat. I thought I was, but it's okay. That's not trauma. That's just a shock. It's a stress. Living in that is trauma. So you go to a war, you get in that fight response. Maybe at the time it's quite adaptive even, but when you come home 10 years later, it's still there. That's a problem. Okay? Fight or flight is not bad temporarily. It is terrible for our health and our relationships and our psychology in many areas if it's sustained. So trauma we can think of as this sustained fight or flight, or going into this full freeze response. That's a shutdown response. And that might be tense, but also might be collapsed or dissociated. This is a somatic way of looking at trauma. So one way of looking at trauma, you can do it with me if you want. So just to remember it, fight is forwards and tense, right? This is fight. Do it with me if you don't mind, because I'll get it in the body, right? Fight. And then we have flight. Eyebrows go up, breath holds. Okay, so forwards and back, fight or flight. They're both aversion in Buddhism, right? And then we have freeze, which can be tense, like an animal that doesn't want to get eaten, right? Okay, or this kind of freeze. Okay, and then we can also just have collapse. This is like long-term learned helplessness in a minute. And then lastly, we got dissociations. This is like not there, like spaced out. Okay, little shake. I don't want to keep you in any of those states for too long. So this is another way of looking at trauma. We can think of it in terms of nervous system health. So for example, Irene Lyon, she's a good educator in the field. She'll talk about nervous system health. That's different from talking about it as a series of illnesses. So maybe you've heard of like post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so that's an illness, and that's a diagnosis which has certain symptoms. The main sets of symptoms I'm going to go into today later on in much more detail, but the main sets of symptoms are hyperarousal, so that's the fight or flight, the agitation, okay, or the numbing, okay, so that's the freezing, the not feeling, maybe lack of empathy. There are others, like you can also think of trauma as a memory disorder, so that's a memory disorder. Yeah, so think of like, I don't know, your last birthday. Hopefully it wasn't traumatic. What was I doing on my birthday? And it's sort of in the past, it's not very live, it's there, but I can remember it. Trauma is more like a dangerous past living in the present. So it's alive. And that could be something like a full flashback. You've heard of flashbacks? It's where you're really imagining now. That's quite rare. More common is you just keep thinking about something. Or sometimes it's a feeling. It's a feeling that you're still there. Part of me, in shamanic perspective, would say part of your soul is in the war, right? I would not laugh at the shamanic perspective. I think.
No, but unless you connected it to it,
Ah.
it's like
Okay.
being present here. Yeah.
Being present is a problem if you have trauma, is in terms of looking at it from a memory. So you see how now we're looking at it from different points of view. We can look at it medically, we can look at it in terms of nervous system, we can look at it in terms of how memory is disordered and how that's, you could look at the neuroscience of that if you wanted to get scientific. I also look at it in terms of learning. So trauma is a learnt response, which is now maladaptive. Okay, so let's say you're a people pleaser. We're going to do a session on this later on, yeah? You've learned that to stay safe is a key word for trauma. Okay, most definitions of trauma involve safe, yeah? To stay safe, you're nice to everyone, and you smile, and you look after everyone else's needs, right? That's not bad, but it might then later on come with a cost, okay? So we can actually say you've learned something. We could even say sometimes we talk about superpowers. So we can look at trauma as a pathology, and that's sometimes the case. If you're waking up every night with nightmares, it's pathology, right? But another way of looking at it is you've learned something. So what's something because of a dangerous situation you got very good at? So you don't need to tell me the dangerous situation, but tell me something you got very good at. Let's hear from like 3 people. I will do questions. So Ava, what's something you got very good at due to a dangerous situation, even for yourself or your cultural background? To be in service. Okay, it's beautiful, but it could actually come from trauma, right? But that's a learned pattern, right? To establish safety, right? And how do you do that? There's different ways.
Well, one is through martial arts, so I taught myself.
Okay, so you literally got good at fighting, right? A lot of people in martial arts are trauma survivors, and more metaphorical, or more behavioral, more broad.
So just taking care of the situation,
Okay.
covered.
Like situational awareness, taking care of things, a good person to have around, right? There's reason these guys are my assistants. They're good people to have around. Get a nice skill set between the two of them, yeah? Balkan gains, yeah? So, but this can come with a cost. So that it might be they didn't learn a skill. So one skill is service. Maybe Ava didn't learn the skill so easily of serving herself, looking after herself. Right? One skill is situational awareness. Another skill is just chilling the fuck out, relaxing, not worrying about the situation. It doesn't matter. We always have a funny game in our apartment because Mira locks the door and I don't. Okay, so it's like, how safe is the world? She locks the door while she's inside, I don't. Who's right? That's not the point. I'm not saying she's wrong or I'm right or I'm wrong. But we have a different sense of safety, right? Yeah. Okay, so trauma is also impacting your thinking. Often it makes your thinking, for example, black and white. Or life and death. Everything's life and death. Yeah. I remember earlier, one of my teachers, I was arguing with him. He's like, Mark, you're not going to die if we disagree. It's like, everything is life or death. Yeah. It's like, that's a trauma response. Perception. Another little funny story. Can I share the beach story? Yes. Yeah. So Mira's from Ukraine. We're sitting on the beach. I'm looking at the waves breaking against this cave. It's very beautiful. It's in Spain. We're on holiday. And I say, look at that beautiful cave. And she said, I wonder how many people died in that cave. I was like, what? I mean, it's sort of a little bit dangerous, I guess. So she's thinking of the danger and the safety. It's possible you could get caught and drowned, But I just didn't think this, right? So I was like, and we laughed because we understood it was like some traumatic thinking to think of danger and life and death, even on holiday, So trauma is affecting our perception, our relationships, right? If I think everyone's dangerous, how am I going to make friends? How am I going to make a boyfriend or whatever, right? Does it make sense? So we can look at trauma through this lens of, it's memory disorder or it's a set of physiological symptoms, but it's really having big impact right into definitely into the relational, but even into the political. If you look at someone like Russia, they keep electing, keep wanting dictators, and it's like, well, if you're traumatized, you want to be told what to do. If you're traumatized, you want a simple life. It's like, imagine this room was on fire. Do you want a dictator or a democracy? You want a dictator. You want someone who says, get out, there's the fire door. You don't want someone who says, what's your opinion on the fire door? What do you think? Let's have a vote. So even in politics, we see trauma expressed. Yeah? Everything. It expresses everywhere. Okay, so that's The basics, we've got 5 minutes before questions before the break. This is kind of, there's lots of ways of saying it. I do a slideshow on this, but this is kind of like what I'd like everyone in the world to know about trauma. Key thing is you have some adaptation to a dangerous or overwhelming past. That adaptation may or may not be helpful today. It involves the nervous system. The good news is you can do something about it. Okay, let me finish with the sort of good news. It's not a life sentence. You can at least reduce it. Yeah. Good. All right. Any questions before the break?
Yeah. Before you were telling about the three trauma responses, fight, flight, and freeze. What about food?
Yeah. People like these. What are they called? Alliterations. Yeah. Fold, fawn, freeze, fuck. I mean, you can keep going. There's no such thing as any of them, really. What we do see in the nervous system is an aversive response, which can be fight or flight. Now, secondary trauma response might be, say, fawn, which means like to be friendly in a fake way. Fake friend is another way of saying it, if you want to keep the Fs. That's actually coming out of fear, right? It's like, I'm scared, so I'm going to make my social situation more safe. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that when I talk about people pleasing. I suspect there's some other things that just don't have an F in English that would be really good as well. Fold, you hear, that's like the collapse. Yeah. But none of these they're not neat boxes, right? This is just some nice model that someone came up with. Yeah. Like the Buddhist model is different from the Western model. For example, in Buddhism, they have aversion and craving. In the Western model, we have fight or flight, which are both aversion, and we don't have anything in craving, which is really weird, and our entire economic system is based on that. Okay, so it's not that the Buddhist model's wrong or the Western model's wrong, they're just two different ways of cutting a cake. Does that make sense? It's a fairly sophisticated answer. But yeah, fawn is something we'll definitely look at. Good, any others? All right, I think we're good.